So, hello everyone. Welcome to another indie author interview. I am joined today by Sheila Masterson, who is the author of The Lost God, as well as the rest of that series. And Song of the Dark Wood, is that the standalone?
Yes, that's the new standalone. Yeah.
Perfect, perfect. So thank you so much for joining me today. And let's just get right into it. So tell me a little bit about your journey to becoming an author and what made you want to go indie rather than trad.
Yeah, so I I wrote the Lost God series pretty much for myself during it was like my COVID survival project, so to speak. And I just really needed something to do with my anxiety. So when I wrote it, I wasn't necessarily thinking, oh, I'm going to publish this. I was just kind of like, I've only ever written short stories and I need something, I'm like incandescent with anxiety and I need something to do with my brain. Like I needed to escape. Um, so when I wrote it, I wasn't necessarily intending that. And I've always been a person who, I really liked writing for fun. Even when I was a kid, I have on my desk, I have a Goosebumps book that I wrote when I was like like 8 or something, and I was always doing that. So I think it was sort of a natural progression to then, I think you graduate school and then you're so busy and you don't really make time for hobbies because you're so busy like living your life. And then it was sort of like this pause to everything and I was like, well, I got to find something to do that kind of brought me back to my love of writing. And I forgot that, like, I think we forget as adults to do things that are for joy. um and I just, when I was writing it, I was having such a good time. And then when I finished it, I had been talking to my friend Tanya Grant, who is also a writer. She is a tradition, well, her first trad book is coming out next year. Um, and she was like, well, what are you going to do with it? And I was like, And so I started looking into the whole query process and I did write like a whole query and I was thinking about it and then decided at the last minute not to because which was the right choice. The Lost God is such a it was always going to be a series, and it's really hard to debut with a series in Chad, and they're long books. And I was like, this is just going to be such a tough sell that I kind of started looking the indie route, and I was like, well, maybe I'll try this. You get there, and I think like a lot of people think it's like if you like you go trad first and then you decide to go indie. But when I looked at it, I was like, I'm so emotionally attached to these books. It would be really difficult for me to go the trad route for them in general. Because then you're opening up to other people saying, oh, it should be this way or it should be that way. And that is a project where I would have had a really hard time with that. Like, not that I didn't edit or, that I didn't get tons of feedback as I was like working through editing the books, but I think it's so different because I think you get to have the vision for what the book is supposed to be when you're indie, and when you go trad, you kind of have to like surrender to whatever their vision for the book is. And I knew that this was a project where I couldn't do that. And so I decided, I think in like November of 2022 that I was like really going to do it. I was sort of like waffling a little bit, even though I was editing the books as if I was going to put them out. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to do it. And never looked back from there, basically.
And I I mean, I think that that's a really big plus of indie publishing is one being able to do it on your schedule and two being able to have that creative control.
Yes.
And I think it's a beautiful thing that indie exists. So I'm really glad that there are indie authors like yourself who do, go the self-publishing route so that they can keep the story the way that they want it to be.
Yeah, and I think that I think that's a mistake that I see some people make is that they love the project so much and they want it to get as much support as possible. And so they think like I'm going to take this the indie route and then end up feeling disappointed because I think that it's like any relationship, right? There's always going to be a compromise, and if it's not when you're indie, you kind of get to decide which compromises you're willing to make. And there are things that are like, okay, this is for the good of the story, and then there are things that are like, this is for the good of the marketing, like, and and those are not always in alignment. So would encourage everybody to if you have writers who are listening to this who are trying to decide. I think a lot of it is it's super personal, and I don't think either way is like right or wrong. I think it can be project specific. It can be the point of life that you're in specific. At the time I was looking for a job, so I was kind of doing this full time, sort of out of because I had been looking for a job for a while. So I had more time than I had anything else. And so I was like, I can do marketing, I can figure all of this other stuff out, I can teach myself how to do like 17 steps of the indie author process, where, people who have young children and full-time jobs and all of that, like it might be a less practical choice depending where you are in life too. I think that's worth mentioning.
Absolutely. Definitely important to kind of spotlight. And so, you kind of said that you wrote this book, for yourself, for joy. How did you write it and how did you write the subsequent books? Like, was there a difference in like plotting, pantsing, planting? How do you write?
So I think what most people would consider the way I wrote that series to very much be pantsing. I am a very intuitive person, and I think that a lot of that process was I had read a ton of books between like 2021 and 2023. I read like probably close to like 500 books. Like I really was in it, And I think some of it was I had a lot of stuff in my head in terms of like timing and pacing and stuff just from repetition and from reading a lot of books. So I knew the midpoint and the end point of book one, and I knew the end point of book two, and that was pretty much all I knew. And I knew the characters a little bit, but I very much was just like, I don't know if I can write a book. Let me see. I've never written anything longer than a short story, so I'll just write until I run out of story. And it took 4 books for that to happen. Um, so, so yeah, a lot of it was really just sort of like surrendering and seeing what happens, which means that my editing process is very robust. I wish I was a person who could like see the whole story ahead of time and be like, oh, I'm going to make good choices in terms of how I'm going to write this scene and whatever. And unfortunately, that's just not how my brain works. So I end up doing a reverse outline and like some pretty intense editing. So I do like, I don't even know. I think The Lost God was like the 15th draft or something. I mean, there were a lot of changes that were made over the course of the story. The general beats were pretty much the same. It was kind of just to make things more concise. Um, and I think that you learn I learn a lot from doing. So I do think I got better as the series went on, because just learning to edit one book is enough to really inform all of the other stuff that you're doing. But I did have to be slightly more planful as I got later in the series, which does not look like anybody who plots or outlines would like laugh at what I consider to be planning, but but for me, it was kind of like, okay, what are all of the things that need to happen in this book for sure, and where do I think I can fit them in? But by no means was it here is the full detailed outline and it's several thousand words. No, it's like one sheet of paper and a hope and a prayer.
I think those are the best books because I hear a lot the phrase like my characters tell me what to write and like what to do. So it kind of sounds like similar to that.
100%. And I think it's so funny because I had some idea of what like certain characters were going to do or what they were going to be to the series, and they decided otherwise. So I'm fully in that camp where I'm like, wait, this was not the plan. Like, why is everybody not cooperating with the plan?
And in that vein, what do you enjoy most about writing fantasy?
Oh my gosh. So I think with fantasy, you get such an easy way to talk about like really complex, serious things that are going on in our world, separated from the intensity of like the current political moment or what's going on, and you have some distance from what you're talking about that I think makes it easy to talk about um, things that are hard or complicated or that people have a lot of like tension with in modern life. And you also get to show power dynamics in a really explicit way that is hard sometimes to do, or just not really what people are looking for when like the outside world is so intense. So I think it's sort of like an escape where you can see contemporary struggles sort of reflected. And for me, reading and writing has always been relational. And so I think um, in fantasy, especially, you get such an opportunity to show these relational themes and to write these characters that people will understand and have things in common with while watching them sort of get to um, live out like some sort of cool magic or, like triumph over whatever oppression is coming for them. And I think that um, it can be really uplifting.
Hmm. I really like that parallel that you said because I think a lot of the time, like for me, like chronic illness is like a big thing. And so one of the authors that I love is Essie Muir, and she writes like endometriosis and PCOS into her fantasy. And I had never seen that before. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I have PCOS, like that's really cool to see that in fantasy. So it's also like that sort of thing, like, bringing in
Yes,
the real world climate, but also like, um, I am making my way through the last Brandon Sanderson Stormlight Archive book. It's taking me forever. But in one of them, one of the characters is like, talks about like having menstrual cramps. And I'm just like, yes, like you can be like this badass female character, but also have these things that like happen to, assign female at birth. Like that's what happens.
absolutely. And I think that that's one of the things that's so cool too. I don't want to spoil anything, but there is
I haven't
something.
read the rest of the series. I've only read The Lost God. I just started there.
Yeah, so there is something like in the series, and I do try to write those things, and I think I also deal with chronic illness and chronic pain, so I think it's also been a way for me to sort of like process complicated feelings about it. But I love reading books like that because I really do think like I remember the first book I ever read that had I get migraines, and the first book that I ever read that had like chronic illness rep was 7 Days in June by Tia Williams, which is a romance. And I, the reason I loved it so much is that like her pain was just like part of the story, right? Like it's just the thing that she deals with. But it does affect the way that she shows up in a relationship. And I had never read somebody who talked about how complicated it is to be in a relationship, like the relationship dynamics of I don't want to feel like a burden to other people, like to someone that I love. And how does this? So the story wasn't about this thing that she deals with, but it absolutely came into her trying to find this relationship and process these things and be a mother and like all of these different things. And I just remember reading that. I read it in one sitting. You know when you like sit down to read a book and it's like you don't move for like 5 hours and then you like finish it and you're like like I'm like the Tin Man now. Like I can't move. Um and I just remember being like, wow, I've never read something like that. And I think it's so cool that so many more, especially in fantasy, like that we're starting to see more chronic illness rep and mental health rep. The Lost God series has a lot of mental health rep because at the time I was writing it, I was going through a lot of anxiety. And so like I think that showing those things and showing people who can still like yes, I'm dealing with this thing and I can still save the world. Like yes, I'm dealing with this thing and I can still have a healthy relationship. I think that's really powerful. And I think that's sort of like the transformational power of writing and reading and having like community around that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Wonderfully said. And so what do you need in your writing space to stay focused? What helps you stay on task?
So I have very bad ADHD.
Me
So
too. See me
So
like
the
I never like I don't say it, but like, I move around a lot just because like I can't sit still. Like it's just like okay, like I'm not getting bored with you. I'm just moving.
Yeah, yeah. So I definitely the spinny chair, and noise canceling headphones. And actually, I hilariously will just walk around with them on my head all the time without them being on. It's just like I
Hmm.
need the reminder that it's quiet. It's so odd. So I don't even like when I'm editing, for example, I don't listen to anything usually. When I'm writing, I'll listen to like whatever my book playlist is. But yeah, a lot of the time I'm just sitting there with headphones on, not listening to anything, not even with the noise canceling on, just with them there because I think it's just a focus thing. And I think when I have them on, it's almost like Pavlovian, where I'm like, okay, this is what we're doing now, you know? But that's honestly the biggest thing. And then the one other thing that I do is I usually have a candle for whatever book I'm
So cool.
working on or character or whatever. So for the Lost God series, it's the magic kind of centers around memory, and smell is a super important part of memory. So um, the characters in the book have a spell that binds like the scent of the day they were born to them. So Cece was born in July, so she smells like summer, like lemons and lavender. And so I had this lemon lavender candle that whenever I was writing, I would light. And it was sort of like, again, I think it's sort of like a signal to my brain, like, okay, this is what we're doing now. Like, you know how it is. You're
Yeah,
like fighting for your life for any bit of focus, you know?
it's hard. It's hard. But I really love that idea, and um, I think we as assigned female at birth, I think we mask a lot of the time. So people are like, oh, like you're fine, like you're good. I'm like, no, actually, I do all these things to make sure that I'm good. And I mean, I have to say, I mean, and I could probably do the math because I inevitably somebody says I have ADHD. I have to say probably at least 80 to 90% of the authors I've interviewed are son female at birth and have ADHD. Like I think that's a
I
beautiful thing
fully
though.
believe it.
That like look at these worlds that we can create because of this, right? So like making something like make the beast beautiful sort of thing.
100%. And I also think that there is something to be said for the ability to hyperfixate. Like I think it would be I don't know what it's like to be neurotypical. I have no idea. So I could not possibly say, but I suspect that it would be harder to sort of like come in and out of a fantasy world if you did not have that ability to like fixate. But I will not be able like I say all the time, and I say this, my one of my critique partners is also neurodivergent. So when I talk to her about stuff, she'll be like, the story is keeping me up at night. Like it's like I gotta get some of this out of my head, or it's literally going to keep me up at night. And I
Mhm.
get that all the time where I'm like, oh man, I really gotta start like moving on this other book, or like it's going to be waking me up and I'm gonna be thinking about it, you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so what is other than, kind of focus, what is was kryptonite for you? What kind of gets in your way?
Okay, so this could be so many things.
Yeah.
Um, I think a lot of it is just social media. I mean, like, and I think this thing happens too once you publish a book and you sort of feel eternally divided. So I am eternally divided between the book that I'm actually writing and the book that I'm promoting at the time because they're never the same one. Like I'm always like pretty far in advance because again, I'm chronically ill and I deal with a lot of um I can't always control how I'm going to feel, so I work pretty far ahead of where I'm publishing. And so right now, for example, I'm finishing up line edits on my spring book, which is coming out in April, which is a spin-off from the Lost God series. And I'm also promoting all of the Lost God audiobooks, which are coming out right
Yeah.
now, and Song of the Darkwood, which just came out in September, which is a standalone in a different world. And it's like I have three brains that I have to like switch between. And I'm also thinking about my fall book for next year, which is partially written that I have to switch back to and finish after this. Um, and then business brain, which is I, at the moment, do not have an agent, but I do have a lot of contracts and stuff that I'm dealing with. So I have a lawyer that I work with, and like I'm also having to do like all of these business decisions. And I think my kryptonite is like the divided attention required to promote books and talk about your backlist and do contracts and make connections and plan ahead for, next year's book. So I'm like trying to do the cover for my fall book and like, and all of that is always like always all of the balls in the air. And I think that is one of the hardest things, especially if you have ADHD and you're already very prone to inattention. It is so tricky to find those moments. So it's been really important to me to do some body doubling. That helps a lot. I have a weekly babysitting date with Liz Libby, who's one of my best writer friends. And she will sit with me on Wednesday nights and we'll always like talk for a little bit and then we'll sprint for a while and then we'll come back. And if one of us is having like an issue with what we're writing, we'll kind of talk through it. And I think that makes a really big difference in how the story goes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Body doubling is something that I discovered because of TikTok, to be honest. And I'm like, oh, wow, this is awesome. I love this. This is great.
So effective. It's so effective. It's crazy.
It is. It is. Okay, so let's go to this next part of the interview. So if you had to describe the Lost God in one sentence or less, what is that sentence?
Oh gosh. It is a The Lost God is the story of Cecilia, who is a memory witch, and her guardian, who have to go on a quest to complete the gauntlet, which is sort of like a grimoire in the language of memory that's stored in these caves in order to release the power of the Lost God and save their kingdom from the God of War. Um, and yeah, I mean, that's one sentence, right? I did it.
Right. And I think I congratulate you for your audiobook deals as well, because I listened to this via audiobook. And like
So
it
good.
was so good. It was and again, like you're like I couldn't put it down. I couldn't pause it. Like I was doing work and obviously I can do more than one thing. So I
Right.
listened and I was like, don't talk to me. Like I just need to listen and do my work and like finish this. It was
Yes.
so well done.
Oh my gosh, I absolutely lucked out so hard because when I sold the rights to Dreamscape Media and I went to them and I was like, "Hey, I have people I would really love to do the book." But it's so tricky because we were moving really fast and we were trying to do all four books pretty much like bang, bang, bang. Um, and Caitlin Kelly is reading Cecilia's POV and she did The Cruel Prince and she's done a bunch of other books, but she is so spot on for Cecilia. Like I don't even know how to explain to people how wild it is to hear somebody perform the scene as you kind of saw it in your head. It is so wild. She is so talented. Like she did such a good job with the first book, and Cece is such an emotional character, and she just has such range, and she does such a good job with all of the other characters. And the rest of the series is multi POV. So you get a little glimpse of it at the very end of The Lost God because we get the two male POVs in the epilogue. But the rest of the series is a little more balanced between the three of them. And we have Tim Campbell playing Xander and Will Dameron playing Raynor. And they are both also just phenomenal. So I got so lucky and I like truly the most talented cast. I've been so blown away.
It's
I
amazing.
can't endorse the audiobooks enough. If you love audio, it's like they are such talented narrators. It's wild.
And I think audiobooks have been a godsend for me because of the
Same.
ADHD. Like, I mean, I can read very fast. I can sit and read a whole book in like one sitting, but I can just read so much more. And I feel like I get into the story more. Like,
Yes. Yeah,
I
yeah,
read
yeah.
the print and then I was like, oh, look, it's on, it's a Libro FM pick for the ALC. So I was like, oh, let me grab it and let me listen to this. And I did. And I was like, oh my God, like, it just puts you in the world. It just puts you in the world, and I just love audiobooks for that reason.
It's such a cool experience. And also for me, a few things like verbal storytelling is a huge part of the book. And so having this audio storytelling is so cool to me because it feels just very meta. And I also, um, at the time that I was working on this book, I was having some issues with my eyes. And so it was also really emotional for me to be able to get the audio deal because I was like, it feels more permanent for me, you know what I mean? And I had like such an emotional reaction to hearing the book for the first time. But I also, accessibility because I'm disabled and chronically ill is super important for me. And so it was also really powerful to be able to have the story in that format from that perspective as well.
I love that. I really do. And so who is your favorite character to write and why?
Oh
If you
gosh.
could choose a child.
It's so hard. I think that I think that Xander is the most fun to write because he just does not do what he's supposed to do ever. Um, and he's just very dynamic. He can very quickly take over a scene, so that also like complicates things sometimes because he's tremendously unserious and very much a character that, like we talked about earlier, will just sort of tell you what's going to happen in the scene, and you're like, no, that's not what we're doing right now. Like this is not what we agreed to. However, I still think that Cece is my favorite to write because she really is the heart of the story, and she was really the inspiration for the series because like we talked about earlier, I was reading a lot of fantasy that had a lot of these very you know, unaffected, like badass, really cool heroines. And Cece is so sensitive and so affected. And so like it was very funny because I wasn't actually diagnosed with ADHD until like a couple months ago, but I have suspected for a long time. It
Yeah.
just takes a really long time to get diagnosed when you're old, like I am. Um,
And when you're female.
Yes, yes, exactly. And so I had this like whole experience of readers messaging me as they were reading her parts and being like, I loved how you wrote I loved how you wrote Cece's somatic experience and I loved how you write her being overstimulated. And I was like, oh yes, that was totally intentional. Like, I don't know how else to write, but I think that having the opportunity to write somebody who is really sensitive and is still badass in her own way and shows like a different type of strength was really important for me because through the course of the series, she is really kind of the emotional heart of the story, and we do get to see her um kind of learn a lot about her own strength where the rest of the world kind of views her in a very specific way. So I think that it would have to be her for that reason.
And on the opposite side, who was the most challenging character to write and why? And maybe it's the same.
Yeah, so it's actually honestly, Rainer was really the hardest character to write because I think like the greater deviation a character is away from the way I express things in the world, the harder it is for me to get into their head. And so he is a character who does feel a lot, but doesn't express a lot. He's very like pent up and very controlled. And so writing his external life and his internal life are two very different things. And in the first book, we mostly see we're in Cece's head almost the entire time. And so we see her perception of him. And then when we get into the memory curse, the number of messages that I get when people listen to Rainer's first POV chapter in the memory curse that are like, how dare you? Like, I'm ruined.
I'm ready for it now, and you will be getting a message.
I'm telling you, because he is somebody who is very externally one way and internally another way. And it was hard to get that balance right. So a lot of his chapters were sort of like rewriting because I'm super expressive. I'm much more like Cece and Xander, where I will kind of say whatever I think and feel. And Rainer is super reserved on all of that. So it took me a while to understand Like what's the thing that's going to push him to a place where he'll talk about something? What's the thing that he's still nervous about or holding back? And I think that was one of the most challenging things to write in the series. And similarly for Evan, who you have sort of met briefly, but kind of becomes a greater part of the story later on. Also really difficult because he is so very stoic and not terribly in touch with his emotions on the other side of things, which I'm like, this is alien to me. I can't imagine, so you have to really use your imagination at that point. But I think that they were the two that were like really challenging.
Mm, mm. Do you have a favorite scene or quote from The Lost God?
Oh, this is such a good question. There is a there's sort of like this quiet scene, and it's later in the book, and this is not a spoiler because you know that this exists early on in the book, but there's a scene, I think it's around chapter like somewhere in the early 30s. And they are all together and they're stopped for lunch, the whole gang. And Teddy asks Cece and Raynor to describe what their bond feels like. And they kind of start talking about it. And in the middle of talking about it, realize that they've never really said a lot of these things out loud because they've had this bond since they were children. Like she was 6 and he was 8. And so sort of the same way that if you learn a language when you're really young, it feels very natural, and trying to then back out and explain how you learned it and what it feels like and all of this other stuff to other people is like sort of strange and not something that they've ever really felt a need to do. And so I think that that was something that as I was writing that scene, I was like, oh, this is like, it was sort of like surprisingly intimate. And they sort of like realize it in the moment. Um, and it's like kind of romantic and but like not in a super in your face kind of way. And I just remember writing that scene and being like, oh my gosh. And when my one critique partner read it, she sent it to me and she was like, this is so romantic. She's like, the way that they're talking about each other is so, and it is like in the middle of talking about it, they sort of realize that it's like this really intimate thing that they're just casually talking about in front of other people. And they kind of are like, oops, like, that was awkward, like that was very glaring. So,
And again, right, they kind of, I like, how you're talking about how they kind of figured it out as they were speaking. Like that, just like that dynamic is just really, really cool.
yeah, yeah. Because you don't like if it's so innate and you've had it for so long, you're not really thinking about it that way. And it's all sort of nonverbal for the two of them. So trying to explain it to other people is is strange and not something that they've done.
Absolutely. And so, since you have audiobooks, verbally, you have some really great representations of your characters, but visually, is there anybody that exists in the world today that kind of inspired you when you think about what your characters look like?
Yeah, so as soon as I saw the promos for My Lady Jane, I was like,
Yes.
Emma Bader is she would be such a good Cece. She is just like spot on the wild hair, even like the very beginning of like how the show opens. It opens with her like trying to escape a marriage, and I was like, this is like so spot on for Cece. Um and then Sean Teal would be my Xander if you have watched Rain or the movie Rosaline on Hulu, which, by the way, if you have not watched it, is so good and so funny. Like, it just is so charming and like adorable. And I loved it. And then for Rainer, it would be probably Theo James, I think. Like, if we could have like a younger Theo James, because Rainer's in his like mid to late 20s, but like that's like the right vibe, like sort of intense.
I like it. I like it.
Yeah.
And I ask this question just because, like, it kind of helps me when, like, go back and read or, compare
Yeah.
series to kind of like visualize it. Definitely, it helps my brain.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so let's get to the last part of our interview here, which is just some fun questions, things that I would want to know if I were getting to know somebody. So other than reading and writing, what are some of your interests and hobbies?
Oh my gosh, it's so embarrassing because this is like all I do. I was laughing when I got this question. I was like, oh, this is confronting.
And then you
Um,
use it for a little while and then you stop and then you pick something else up.
yeah, yeah. No, I have we like to so my fiance and I like to go out for cocktails. We always appreciate a good cocktail. I always do a drink for my characters whenever I do a book launch. So all of my characters have their own cocktails.
Oh, cool.
So that's the thing that we really like. And we try to like travel. Like that's something that I've really done a lot of that I enjoy. Obviously, the COVID years were not so great for that, but we still found some stuff to do. Um, so those are like really the top things other than reading and writing. But reading and writing are really those are the most consuming ones, you know?
And so we can talk a little bit about reading. I'm going to get my Goodreads up here. So, who are some authors or books that you would recommend?
Oh my gosh. Okay. So I thought about this ahead of time because I always like need to like think about in relation to my series especially. So I'd say if you really like the multi POV like badass FMC found family kind of vibe, I would go with Nicole Platania, who's one of my good
You know, it's
friends.
so weird. I knew you were going to say that. I
Yeah,
I
Curse of
just like felt
Ophelia
that like
series.
I knew you were going to say that. I love it. I love it so much.
Yeah. The Curse of Ophelia, like of all of my friends, when I've been reading that series, and I'm still in the middle of it, I was like, this is the one that I feel like kind of vibes. Some of it's the friendship, it's like having these old relationships that have some baggage. But Ophelia's such a cool character. Like we talk about it all the time. We're like, how would our characters get along or whatever? And I'm like, Stacey would have such a crush on Tulloch, like without a doubt, like, and would listen
So
to, like,
much.
would hang on his every word in a way that like drives like her guys crazy. And she would like look up to Ophelia so much because Ophelia's like she is very like emotionally tough, you know, where Cece's like a lot, not that Ophelia isn't sensitive, but like I laugh about it all the time because I'm like I can totally see them like getting along. And I feel like if people vibe with the Lost God series and that like multi POV element, I feel like they would really vibe with The Curse of Ophelia. Um if you like the forbidden love and agonizing pining of the series, I would recommend my friend Victoria Meyer wrote Beyond the Aching Door. And it's like almost like a contemporary urban fantasy, sort of mixed with an epic fantasy. But it is so good. And like if
You
you're
know,
just
if
a
you
person.
scroll down on that page, it's A Song of the Dark Wood is a reader's also enjoyed.
Yes, yes, yes. I'm not surprised at all because we do kind of run in the same circles. And she lives in the next town over. So her and I get
Oh, that's
coffee like once
awesome.
a month too. Yeah. But that is like a book that I'm like, this has like the yearning. Like I want to read so much angst and pining. And like that is like my go-to like angst and pining series. And then if you are more of like a Song of the Darkwood person and you really like that sort of fractured fairy tale vibe, my friend Janessa Wren has a book called Heir of Sun and Moon. And it's part of her Five Realms series. And it is a sort of like fractured darker tangled, you know, like there's like Rapunzel elements, and then throughout the series there are more Disney princesses vibes that
And
come
what's the author's
in.
name?
Janessa Wren.
Like Ariane. Found
Yes,
it. Okay, Aaron.
yes,
Got it. Got it.
yeah. um it's it's so good. And then I always have to give a plug for my critique partner. If you are a rom-com person and you just like love a romance, especially if you are a theater person, she just put out a college theater rom-com called Off Book that is so good. The nostalgia, the vibes. Her name is Liz Libey. And it is I like when I was reading it, I was like fully back in it. I was such a theater kid, and it just gave me all of the vibes. All of her books are phenomenal, but that was like the one that I latched onto like immediately, and I was like, more of this. And there is also like it like deals with some more serious themes as well, like some parental stuff with one of the characters. And then we also have demisexual rep, which is cool, bisexual and demisexual rep, which is amazing. And they're done so well, and like it's just so good. So if you're like, I need a break from the fantasy, I need something like real world, that's like the vibe I would go with.
Perfect. I got some new books to read.
I
Okay.
can never just give one book rack. I do
But those are
apologize.
all good, and I like that you pulled like different tropes and things from your books and said if you like this, this is what you like. I like that.
Yeah, well, that's like for me, that's like how I love to get Rex. Like if people are like,
Yeah.
oh, if you liked this part of this book, this
Yeah.
is a really good match. I'm like, yes, that's what I want.
Perfect. And so if you had to give advice to a younger you or an aspiring author, what would that advice be?
Oh my gosh, this is so hard. And I'm gonna try not to cry, but I might cry because I am just like Cece. So I think that one of like the top things I would tell people is to be yourself. And the reason I say this is because like on social media, you sort of always have to perform a little bit, right? Like if you're not having a good day, if you're in pain, like this is like part of the reality, right? But and it doesn't mean that you have to be your whole self all the time or that you have to share every single thing that you're dealing with or like feel super overexposed. But I think you have to find out what you're comfortable with and really stick to that and not try to do necessarily what everybody else is doing. Because once you once you pick a persona that's not you, you're kind of stuck with it. And what I have seen is I think that um, the people who get stuck sort of performing feel a level of burnout that is so high, and you can kind of never really step back from that without seeming like being phony. And I think that, and I understand like the desire to not be perceived and all of that. Like, I think that's very real. And anytime you're putting stuff out there is always super vulnerable. But I think you have to kind of find a way to walk the line between showing up as yourself, showing up authentically, and doing like a completely manufactured version of yourself, because I think that's like a surefire way to burn out really quickly. Um, and then like that's sort of like on the personal level. But the other thing is, I think that, you know, my biggest advice that I give to everyone is that you have to write the thing you love, not just because you're going to read it a million times, but you are, um, but because you also have to edit it a million times and then you're going to have to sell it a million times. So you're going to be talking about it forever, and you kind of have to be, before anybody else has a vision for it or an idea for it, you have to have a vision for it, and you have to be able to talk about it, and you have to be able to like get hyped for it. And that is like one of the hardest parts, I think, because a lot of us want to be writers. We don't necessarily want to be marketers and doing all of these other things, but I think that you really need to believe in the story in order to help push it up the hill, because this is a hard business. And in order to be excited to talk about it, I think you have to really write about something that's real. And I always say, like, I think you have to write, everybody has something kind of stuck at the center of them. And I think you have to write from that stuck place, because if you don't write from that thing that means so much to you, that thing at the center of you, I think it's very easy to fall off and to get frustrated and to give up. But if you are writing from that place and you feel so strongly about the story that you're telling and you know that it's important, I think that you can kind of keep pushing yourself when you feel like you're like struggling up that hill, so to speak. Um, and as far as advice for my younger self, I would tell myself that, whew, I would tell myself that someday you're going to be able to make sense of all of those big feelings, and what you write will help other people make sense of them too.
Mm. That's beautiful. That's a beautiful thing, and feeling through writing too. I've heard a lot.
100%.
Mm.
Yeah. And I think that people underestimate how healing it can be. I think for me, especially writing some of the mental health challenges in the Lost God series, I knew that it was healing to write them. What I wasn't counting on was how healing it would be to have people relate to them and to say like, wow, I felt really seen by this chapter or this experience, and I didn't realize that other people felt that way, and like it really made me feel seen. Which I think that's what we're all trying to do. You know, for me, reading and writing has always been so relational. And um, I feel like the best stories and the ones that have stuck with me are the ones that made me feel seen in that way and gave me the words for this thing that was stuck in me, you know?
And I think I mean, that's a big reason why I started doing these other interviews is because like I mean, I'm a therapist, so I like, kind of getting into, that sort of, piece about like where were you coming from when you were writing it and like
Yeah.
that like extra layer. But I think it's also just like I feel honored to like talk with, authors such as yourself who are willing to be vulnerable in those ways that maybe like not everybody knows that is like that it's like an own voices or that's what you go through. But nevertheless, like you said, relationally, everybody, could have the potential to feel that way.
Yeah.
And I think that that's like a beautiful thing is that like you're willing to put a piece of yourself in that, I think it's really,
Yeah, for sure. And it does like I mean it does feel vulnerable. It does feel uncomfortable because there will also be people who don't get it and who are like, this is so weird and why is she crying on every page and like all of that stuff. And and I get it because it's not going to be everybody's experience, but there are going to be people and my one of my best friends is a narrator. And she said this thing to me really early on, after The Lost God came out, where she said, like, there are so many people who are going to be moved by this story and by all of the future stories that you're going to tell. And if you get discouraged by people who don't get it, then like you're not going to be serving them. And probably a lot of them are never going to say anything. And, you know, they're reading this and they're feeling really seen and understood and do it for them, like, right for those people, because the loudest people are not always like right, or so to speak, you know, and it is really hard with social media. And, you know, there's never been a time in history where writers have had access to all of their reviews all of the time and like to be tagged in them and to be, you know, and I think like don't underestimate the fact that that piece is difficult, you know, and that even on the best days it can really be a struggle. But I also think that there are many more people who are feeling like moved by what you write, and it's a brave thing to put your work out there and to be vulnerable in that way. But also I think you know, in a lot of ways stories save us in all different ways, and you don't know who you're speaking to when you put that book out. So
and you'll find your audience, you'll find your readers.
absolutely, yeah.
And so you talked a little bit earlier about how you don't listen to music while you edit, with words or at all.
Um, at all, usually with editing, because there's just like so much going on in my brain.
Yeah.
Sometimes if I'm editing a specific scene and it has a vibe, I can listen to one song repeatedly like a crazy person. This is a very, I just recently learned that this is like a super neurodivergent thing. It's like, did I listen to this?
Yeah.
Like Spotify Wrapped is always like, it's
Are
always
you
like, you're
okay?
neurodivergent. Yeah, like, you have ADHD. You listened to this song 400 times in one day. Are you good? Like, you
Like,
know?
do you like so you listen to songs for specific scenes and such at times? Um,
Yeah, when
I
I'm drafting, I'm almost always listening to music. So sometimes if I'm in something really difficult, like a fight scene or something like that, I might not. But generally, I have a playlist for every book. That's one of the first things I do when I am starting a new project is creating a playlist. So there, and then I pull like the listening, like the reader playlist from that playlist. So so the Lost God series has a chapter by chapter playlist for every book in the series. So like if you go and look at The Lost God, it's like the first track is the prologue, the second track is chapter one, you know. Um that was insane. That was very hard to do. I will not be doing that again for future series. We'll go more general with the vibes. But the playlist for Song of the Dark Wood is also if you like love a spooky like very Florence and the Machine style forest, like sentient forest kind of playlist. Like that I say is like my magnum opus. Like I'm like this playlist is so eerie and so cool. I'm very proud of it. So
I love that. I like pairing those things together. Even
yeah.
though I can't listen while I read. It's just
Same, I can't either, but sometimes I like to have the vibes, you know?
I like having like I do like the on YouTube like the crackling fire thing. I put that on when I read and I can listen to the crackling fire, but nothing else.
Yeah.
Okay, so last question is do you have any upcoming events or signings or places that we can meet you at? That
Yeah,
you don't have?
so in 2025, I'm only doing one event because again, I do work full time and I'm chronically ill, so doing more than one is a challenge. But I'm doing Villains and Vixens, which is in Dallas, Texas in September. And I'm super excited about it. I am an extroverted author, which like a lot of my peers are not. And I joke that I adopt all of the introverted authors and make them be my friend, which I do. Um, and so I love meeting people. So if you are a person who's like, I'm awkward, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm gonna be weird. What if she thinks I'm weird? You can start at my table. I'm really weird, and also I'll do most of the talking because I never shut up. So so I'm a good place to start. I put a thing out. I did Imaginarium this year and I put something out ahead of time on my Instagram and basically said what if I like it was like just a question that was like, what if I'm awkward? And I'm like, listen, I sit there at my desk all day and talk to myself and have conversations with my imaginary friends. You're not the weird one here, okay? Like truly.
That
So
does. Well,
I love meeting readers. And I get so excited and I get really like I get like a lot of energy from it. I mean, I'll also be tired because I am neurodivergent and chronically ill, so I'll be very tired afterwards. But like emotionally energized from being around people. So, yeah.
and that's a big event. That's like a bucket list event that I want to go to that. I want to go to Sinners and Stardust. I want to do
Yes.
Imaginarium. I did Romantic BookCon in October. So that was
Oh,
really
nice.
fun. So I did that one. So I kind of need to keep going to some, but time and money.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Felt, yeah, like truly, I know. I'm so excited because this will be the first time I've like really traveled.
yeah.
Like I've never flown to an event before. Imaginarium, I live in outside Philadelphia, and so Imaginarium was just like a drive down to DC for me with the car so full of stuff. So I'm really looking forward to it. But and I'm hoping to do like some smaller things. And if you like my books and you are interested in like virtual events and stuff. I do we call them we call them pajama parties. And usually it's either like the night before or the night after a book has come out and I do a spoiler chat with my ARC team and they can ask any questions related to the book and it's fully a spoiler chat and you can ask about anything and we'll chat about it. So I do a lot more like virtual events. I'm also doing College of Lore is doing a like a writer event next year. So if there are any writers, I am doing several panels on their virtual summit next year, which I'm super excited about as well. And that's in July. I don't think all of the details about that have been formally announced yet, but I do think I can say that I'm doing it. So
cool, cool. Well, I mean, those are some really great events. And I thank you again for taking the time to talk with me today. It's been wonderful getting to know you
yeah.
and know more about your books. As I continue the series, it's going to be a lot
Yeah.
of
Oh my
reading.
gosh. Yeah, definitely keep me updated. Let me know how it goes. And I am so delighted to be here. This was so much fun.
Awesome. Thanks, Sheila.
Thank you.